Somewhere in the United States right now, a jar of peanut butter is being twisted open in a kitchen. A school cafeteria is slapping together a sandwich that violates at least 3 modern allergy policies, and a farmer in the red clay of southern Georgia is watching a crop mature that, a century ago, was considered fit only for hogs and enslaved laborers. The peanut is not a garnish in American life. It is closer to a foundation stone. Americans eat it by the billions of pounds every single year. It anchors an agricultural economy across the Deep South, and it shows up in candy bars, in livestock feed, in industrial oil, and in nearly every school lunchbox in the country. That kind of ubiquity tends to make us stop asking questions. We assume it was always this way, that the peanut simply arrived on American tables the way it arrived in the snack aisle, quietly and without incident. But that is not what happened. Not even close. The real story of the peanut involves slave ships crossing the Atlantic, a plantation aristocracy that openly despised the crop as beneath contempt, a biblical-scale insect plague that brought the cotton economy to its knees, and a formerly enslaved scientist who became a kind of folk, saint largely because of a legend that, as we will see, is not actually true. So how did a crop dismissed for generations as Goober peas, barely worth mentioning next to cotton and tobacco, end up rebuilding the broken agricultural backbone of the American South? How did a plant carried in the holds of slave ships become tied, decades later, to emancipation-era survival, then to soil science, then to one of the most mythologized scientists in American history? The answer runs through ancient South American farmland, colonial trade routes, a war that nearly destroyed the nation, an invasive beetle the size of a grain of rice, and a laboratory in Alabama where a man who had once been someone's property became one of the most famous agricultural minds of his era. Stick with this one, because the peanut's journey from slave food to southern salvation crop is stranger, and considerably more consequential than almost anyone realizes. To understand how the peanut ended up rebuilding a broken region, you have to go back roughly 7,000 years, long before there was a South or a North, long before there was cotton or tobacco, or the ships that carried either. The plant we call the peanut, Arachis hypogea, did not begin its life as an American staple crop at all. It began as a wild legume, domesticated by ancient farmers who noticed something unusual about it, something that made it unlike almost every other food crop being cultivated at the time. Instead of flowering above ground and dropping seed the way beans or grains do, the peanut plant flowers, then bends downward and buries its own fertilized pods directly into the soil to mature. A process botanists call geocarpy. Early farmers had, in effect, domesticated a plant that hides its own harvest underground, which meant that generation after generation of indigenous cultivators had to learn a completely different rhythm of planting, tending, and digging than they used for crops that ripened in plain sight. Archaeological evidence, including preserved pods and peanut-shaped pottery, shows the crop spreading steadily across the continent, carried along trade routes, and adapted to different climates, becoming embedded in daily meals as both a practical source of protein and fat, and, in some cultures, an item of ceremonial and symbolic significance. This was not a marginal food. It was a staple sturdy enough and calorie-dense enough to sustain civilizations for millennia before a single European ship ever crossed the Atlantic. Then, beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese and Spanish traders, already reshaping global commerce through colonization, encountered the peanut and did what colonial trading networks did with almost every crop they found valuable: they moved it. Portuguese traders carried peanuts across the Atlantic to West Africa, where the plant took root with startling speed, thriving in soils and climates that suited it well, and quickly becoming a dietary staple across multiple African regions and cultures, incorporated into stews, sauces, and daily subsistence farming within a few generations. This is the detail that gets lost in most retellings of the peanut story. The part where the crop essentially completes a full circuit, domesticated in one place, transplanted into Africa, absorbed so thoroughly into African agriculture and cuisine that by the time the next chapter of this story begins, the peanut is functioning as an African staple crop, not a South American curiosity. And it is specifically because of that African integration that the peanut ends up where it does next. When European slave traders began forcibly transporting millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, they stocked their ships with cheap, calorie-dense, easily stored provisions to feed captives during the brutal, months-long crossing. And the peanut, already a dietary staple throughout West Africa, was a logical, low-cost choice. That is the uncomfortable, often glossed-over truth sitting at the center of the peanut's arrival on this side of the ocean. It did not arrive as a celebrated delicacy or a promising cash crop. It arrived as cargo, as rations for human beings being transported in chains, planted afterward in small subsistence gardens by enslaved people who recognized the crop from home and kept its cultivation alive on plantation soil, long before anyone in the plantation aristocracy thought it worth a second glance. Once ashore in the American South, the peanut settled into a strange kind of agricultural limbo. It was not banned, not persecuted, simply ignored by the people who held the power to decide what counted as valuable. Those people were plantation owners, and in the 18th and 19th century South, value had a very specific definition. It meant cotton. It meant tobacco. It meant crops that could be baled, cured, shipped to Liverpool or Richmond, and converted into the kind of fortune that built white-columned mansions and financed seats in state legislatures. Against that backdrop, a low, unglamorous vine that buried its own seeds in the dirt did not register as an economic proposition. It registered as something enslaved people grew in the scraps of land behind their cabins, in the gardens plantation owners grudgingly allowed, so that the people they enslaved could supplement the meager rations doled out from the plantation stores. The peanut thrived there, in that overlooked margin, because it asked for almost nothing. It tolerated poor, sandy soil that would barely support cotton. It needed no elaborate irrigation, no expensive tools, no oversight from a white overseer standing in judgment. It grew quietly, underground, out of sight, which turned out to be a fairly accurate metaphor for its entire status in Southern society at the time. Enslaved cooks incorporated it into stews and roasted it over open fires, echoes of the West African cooking traditions their ancestors had carried across the ocean, techniques and flavors that would, generations later, feed directly into what we now call Southern cuisine, though credit for that lineage would take a very long time to catch up with the facts. Plantation owners, when they noticed the crop at all, called it by names that told you exactly how seriously they took it. Goober peas, from the Kikongo word nguba, was the folksy term that stuck, and it stuck precisely because it sounded small, rustic, unserious. A word for something you fed to hogs, rather than something you shipped to European markets. And feeding hogs is in fact largely what the peanut was used for whenever white landowners bothered to cultivate it at all. It was regarded as forage, livestock feed, a way to fatten pigs cheaply before slaughter, filed away in the same mental category as turnips or corn husks. Useful, certainly, but beneath the dignity of a cash crop. This is the part of the story you rarely hear in the tidy textbook version. The fact that for the better part of 2 centuries, the peanut sat in plain sight across the American South, feeding enslaved people, feeding livestock, sustaining an entire underground food culture, while the plantation economy roared on around it, blind to the value buried in its own soil. Cotton was king, tobacco was its loyal court, and the peanut was beneath even being counted as a subject. That dismissal would prove, in the most literal agricultural sense imaginable, to be a catastrophic failure of imagination, because the very crop the plantation aristocracy refused to take seriously would eventually be the only thing standing between total collapse and survival. Once the kingdom of cotton met an enemy it could not outspend, outlaw, or outrun. You have probably heard the story. Confederate soldiers, half-starved and threadbare, roasting peanuts over campfires, calling them Goober peas, singing a jaunty little tune about it that somehow survives in American folk memory to this day. It is a charming image, and it happens to be one of the few peanut legends that is not entirely fabricated. But like most tidy legends, it leaves out almost everything that actually mattered. The song Goober Peas was real, written sometime during the war and popularized afterward, and it does capture something true, that by the final desperate years of the conflict, Confederate troops facing collapsing supply lines were indeed foraging and eating peanuts in significant quantities. Sometimes because there was simply nothing else in the field to eat. That much checks out. What does not check out is the romanticized version, where peanuts show up as a beloved battlefield staple, issued neatly alongside hardtack and salt pork from the earliest days of the war. The documentary record tells a messier story. Peanuts were not a standard Confederate ration item established by policy. They were scavenged, traded, and grown informally, often by soldiers themselves in camp gardens, or purchased from local farmers and formerly enslaved people who had kept the crop alive for generations already. In other words, the peanut did not sustain the Confederacy because some quartermaster in Richmond suddenly recognized its nutritional value. It sustained individual, hungry men because the crop was already deeply embedded in the informal food economy of the region, an economy built quietly by enslaved and formerly enslaved communities long before any general in grey or blue ever thought to write it into a supply requisition. And what about Union troops? Here the mythology gets even thinner. There is little solid evidence of peanuts playing any comparable role in the Union Army's diet, since Northern forces generally had more reliable access to established rations and supply chains, whatever their own considerable miseries. The peanut's wartime significance was overwhelmingly a Southern, and specifically a foraging economy phenomenon, tied to scarcity rather than strategy. The truly consequential part of this chapter, the part almost nobody puts in the folk song, happened after Appomattox, not during the fighting. As soldiers from both armies marched home through Southern territory, many encountered peanuts for the first time, whether roasted at a roadside stand or growing in a plot they passed. They carried the taste north with them. Returning veterans, displaced farmers, and newly freed black communities searching for cash crops in a devastated economy all began growing and selling peanuts more widely than ever before. The war did not hand the peanut to America on a silver platter of military rations. It cracked open, quite literally, a nationwide appetite for it, planting the seed, so to speak, for the industry that was about to become an economic necessity rather than a curiosity. Every empire believes itself permanent right up until the moment it isn't, and the cotton empire of the American South was no exception. For nearly a century, cotton had been the region's monarch, its monoculture stretching across millions of acres, its profits propping up plantation aristocracies and financing entire state economies. Then came an invader smaller than a grain of rice, and the monarch fell. The boll weevil did not arrive with cannon fire or declarations of war. It arrived quietly, crossing from Mexico into the southern United States, working its way steadily eastward over the following years, a slow-motion invasion that outpaced every attempt to stop it. Farmers watched it spread field by field, county by county, state by state, with the grim inevitability of a rising floodwater. Nothing in the agricultural arsenal of the era could hold it back. The weevil laid its eggs inside cotton bolls, and its larvae devoured the crop from the inside out, turning fields that had once produced fat white bolls into brittle blackened stalks. Chemical pesticides of the time were primitive and largely ineffective. Crop rotation was resisted because cotton was, for so many farmers, the only crop they knew how to grow, the only crop the local banks would extend credit against, the only crop the entire regional economy had been built to support. That dependency, once a source of stability, became a trap. When the weevil hit, it did not just damage a harvest. It collapsed a financial system built on a single plant. Landowners who had spent generations amassing wealth through cotton monoculture found themselves suddenly, catastrophically insolvent. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers, already living on thin margins, were pushed into outright destitution. Banks that had extended credit against expected cotton yields called in loans they would never see repaid. Entire counties saw their assessed property values crater within a few growing seasons. This was not a slow economic decline. It was a rapid, brutal unraveling, farm by farm, family by family, spreading with the same relentless geography as the insect itself. Moving eastward from Texas toward Georgia and the Carolinas, newspapers of the period described scenes of abandoned farmland, of families walking away from mortgaged property because the crop underneath it was worthless. Local governments, dependent on cotton tax revenue, found their own budgets gutted. The plantation aristocracy that had once dismissed peanuts as a lowly, beneath notice, subsistence crop for enslaved and formerly enslaved communities, now found itself desperate for literally anything else that could grow in southern soil and generate income. Consider the irony sitting quietly underneath all this devastation. For decades, the crop capable of thriving in poor, sandy soil with minimal inputs. The crop that required no elaborate infrastructure and had already been quietly cultivated in small garden plots by black farmers for generations, had been sitting in plain sight, disregarded as unserious. Now, with cotton in ruins, that same overlooked plant suddenly looked less like a curiosity and more like a lifeline. The stage was set for a radical shift in southern agriculture, and what the region needed now was not sentiment, but proof, hard science demonstrating that this humble legume could actually replace what cotton had lost. That proof, and the man who would provide it, was about to walk onto the scene from the unlikeliest of starting points imaginable. Enter George Washington Carver, a man whose early life reads less like a biography and more like a catalogue of obstacles overcome. Born into slavery in Diamond Grove, Missouri, sometime around 1864, Carver was kidnapped as an infant along with his mother by night raiders, and while he was eventually recovered, His mother was never seen again. He grew up frail, often too sick for field work, and turned instead toward plants, developing what neighbors reportedly called a preternatural talent for nursing sick vegetation back to health. He would spend decades chasing an education that most institutions refused to give him because of his race, eventually earning a master's degree in agricultural science from Iowa State, becoming the institution's first black faculty member in the process. In 1896, Booker T. Washington recruited him to head the agricultural department at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and it was there, amid the wreckage the boll weevil had made of southern farmland, that Carver's real work began. His mission was not glamorous. It was soil chemistry. Carver understood that cotton, grown season after season on the same acreage, stripped nitrogen from the earth until the ground itself became exhausted, a condition that made the boll weevil's damage even more catastrophic. His solution was crop rotation, alternating cotton with nitrogen-fixing plants like peanuts and sweet potatoes to restore fertility naturally, without costly chemical fertilizer that struggling farmers could not afford. He preached this gospel relentlessly, traveling the region in a mobile classroom nicknamed the Jesup Wagon, demonstrating techniques directly to impoverished farmers who had no formal agricultural training and no financial cushion left to absorb further mistakes. The peanut, in Carver's hands, stopped being a garden curiosity and became a scientific instrument for rebuilding depleted land. But Carver had a problem that every good scientist eventually runs into. He could convince farmers to plant peanuts for the sake of the soil, but he could not yet convince anyone there was money in doing so. A crop nobody wanted to eat or sell in bulk was still, functionally, a crop nobody wanted to grow. So Carver turned to publicity, and this is where the science starts blurring into legend. He produced bulletins listing dozens, and eventually hundreds, of potential uses for the peanut, everything from dyes and plastics to cosmetics and industrial oils. An exercise designed to prove to skeptical farmers and investors that this was not a dead-end crop, but a versatile commodity with genuine market potential. Some of these formulations were rigorously tested. Many were speculative, more proof of concept than finished product, closer to a research pitch than a factory blueprint. Yet in the retelling, over decades of textbooks and folklore, that distinction quietly vanished, and Carver's promotional bulletins transformed into a legend of over 300 separate peanut inventions. A myth so durable it eventually attached itself to one product in particular, one so central to American culture that its false origin story became almost unshakable. So let's address it directly, because it is perhaps the most widely believed false fact in American culinary history. George Washington Carver did not invent peanut butter. Not first, not alone, not even close. The idea that a jar of ground peanuts sitting in millions of American pantries owes its existence to Carver's laboratory at Tuskegee is a myth so deeply embedded in textbooks, trivia nights, and classroom posters that unraveling it feels almost like sacrilege. But the documented history tells a very different story, one with earlier inventors, earlier patents, and earlier commercial products that had nothing to do with Carver at all. Peanut paste, in various crude forms, had already been made by numerous cultures for generations, since grinding legumes into paste is not exactly a technological leap requiring 20th century genius. What Carver actually did was study peanuts as an agricultural commodity and promote their industrial and nutritional versatility as part of his broader crop rotation campaign, work that was genuinely important. But inventing the peanut butter recipe or process was never part of what he claimed, and it was never part of what the historical record supports. So how did the myth take hold so completely? Partly it is simple narrative convenience. American history, especially as taught in simplified form to school children for much of the 20th century, loves a tidy origin story with a single named hero. And Carver, as a black scientist whose actual achievements were already extraordinary, was an irresistible subject for that kind of flattening. It was easier to teach one man and one invention than to explain the messy, decentralized, multi-inventor reality of how peanut butter actually entered the American food supply through parallel commercial efforts by food companies and entrepreneurs working independently of Tuskegee entirely. There is also a deeper irony here, worth sitting with. Carver's actual legacy, rebuilding Southern soil science and giving broke farmers an alternative to cotton monoculture, is arguably more impressive and more historically significant than inventing a sandwich spread. Yet the peanut butter myth crowded out that more complicated, more consequential story. Because a jar of peanut butter is something every American child can hold in their hands, while soil chemistry and crop rotation economics do not fit neatly on a cereal box or a classroom bulletin board. The myth persisted for decades, not because anyone was maliciously lying, but because it was simply more marketable than the truth. Textbook publishers repeated it, encyclopedias repeated it, and eventually it calcified into unquestioned fact. The kind of thing everybody just knows, even though nobody can quite point to where they first heard it or what evidence backs it up. That is how peanut butter became Carver's invention in the public imagination, not through fraud, but through the quiet, compounding effect of a good story outcompeting a complicated one, generation after generation, until the myth became more real than the research it buried. So if Carver did not build the peanut butter industry, who did? The answer is not one person, but an entire machinery of commerce that assembled itself piece by piece across the early 20th century, largely indifferent to the man in Alabama grinding legumes into paste for demonstration purposes. Food companies figured out how to stabilize peanut paste so it would not separate on the shelf, and grocery chains figured out how to sell it in tins and jars to a public that had, only decades earlier, considered the peanut fit mainly for hogs and enslaved laborers. That reversal alone deserves a moment of appreciation. A crop once dismissed as Goober peas, barely worth a Southern gentleman's notice, was now being packaged, branded, and shipped into pantries across the country. Mechanization did the rest. Hand harvesting, the back-breaking work of pulling peanut plants from the ground and picking pods by hand, gave way to mechanical pickers and diggers that could clear fields in a fraction of the time, transforming peanuts from a garden crop into a genuine agribusiness commodity grown at industrial scale across Georgia, Alabama, and Texas. Marketing did not lag behind the machinery. Peanuts and peanut butter were pitched as wholesome, affordable, distinctly American food, the kind of product that could be sold to a nation with a growing appetite for convenient, shelf-stable protein. The crop that once fed the enslaved and the desperate was rebranded, quite deliberately, as a symbol of ordinary American abundance. And for a while, that rebranding worked exactly as intended. Peanuts became a staple. Peanut butter became a lunchbox fixture. The industry grew fat and confident. But industries built on mass production and thin profit margins tend to develop a dark side. And the peanut business was no exception. As processing scaled up, so did the risks of contamination. And the industry's later history includes documented cases of tainted peanut products entering the food supply, Incidents that exposed just how much trust consumers had placed in a business that did not always deserve it. Outbreaks of foodborne illness linked to contaminated peanut products forced a public reckoning, revealing gaps in inspection, accountability, and corporate transparency that had gone unaddressed for years while profits climbed. The peanut, once a symbol of resourcefulness and survival, briefly became a symbol of institutional failure, a reminder that industrialization solves some problems while quietly creating new ones. Before we get further into that reckoning and how the industry was forced to change afterward, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because we are about to walk through exactly how a beloved American staple became the subject of federal investigation and how the fallout reshaped an entire supply chain. It is a story that connects directly back to everything we have already covered, from Carver's soil science to the marketing campaigns that turned peanuts into a household name, because every stage of this crop's rise added new layers of scale, new layers of profit, and new layers of risk. The peanut had gone from ritual food to slave ration, to agricultural salvation, to industrial commodity. Now, it was about to become something else entirely. A case study in what happens when an entire regional economy gets rebuilt around a single, humble legume, and what gets exposed when that empire is finally forced to answer for its failures. Today, the United States produces billions of pounds of peanuts a year, and the average American consumes several pounds of them annually, most of it in the form of peanut butter spread across sandwiches in school lunches, military rations, and kitchen cabinets in every income bracket. Peanuts show up in candy bars, in cooking oil, in livestock feed, in cosmetics, in industrial lubricants, a strange afterlife for a crop once dismissed as fodder for animals and food for the enslaved. Georgia alone grows nearly half the nation's peanut crop, and the industry as a whole generates billions of dollars annually, supporting tens of thousands of farming jobs across a swath of the South that once depended almost entirely on cotton. Remember that number from the beginning. Remember the strange fact that a legume once considered too lowly for a white Southern table now anchors a multi-billion-dollar agricultural empire stretching from dusty Texas panhandle farms to the shelves of every grocery store in the country. That transformation did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quickly. It happened because an insect destroyed an empire built on cotton, because a formerly enslaved scientist saw salvation in a crop nobody respected, because factories learned to mechanize what hands used to do, because marketers turned necessity into nostalgia, and because regulators eventually forced an entire industry to answer for the corners it had cut. Ritual gave way to commerce. Commerce gave way to industrialization. Industrialization gave way to propaganda, and propaganda gave way to scandal, and scandal, eventually, gave way to reform, tighter inspection standards, mandatory testing protocols, and a supply chain forced to take food safety as seriously as it had once taken profit margins. Out of all of that came the modern peanut economy, mechanized, industrialized, and global, with American peanuts now exported to dozens of countries, sold as everything from raw shelled nuts to processed protein powder, feeding both the domestic market and international demand for an affordable, shelf-stable source of protein and fat. The soil that Carver worked to save now produces a crop that helped diversify Southern agriculture away from the single crop dependency that had made the region so vulnerable to something as small as a boll weevil in the first place. Farmers who once faced bankruptcy from a cotton monoculture now rotate peanuts through their fields as standard practice. A quiet, permanent monument to a piece of agricultural advice that was mocked as impractical when it was first offered from the back of a mule-drawn wagon. Think about that for a second. A crop carried onto slave ships as an afterthought, grown in the small garden plots of the enslaved because it was considered beneath the notice of plantation owners, became the very thing that rebuilt the broken economic foundation those plantations left behind. No cotton baron planned that. No policymaker engineered it. It happened because an insect, a scientist, a handful of manufacturers, and millions of ordinary consumers each pushed the story forward, without any of them seeing the whole picture. The peanut did not just survive its journey from ritual food to slave ration to industrial commodity. It quietly rebuilt an entire region in the process, and it did it while everyone was looking the other way.